You shouldn't exist, and neither should I. That is not philosophy. That is not poetry. That is a biological fact that most people never stop long enough to feel the full weight of. When you trace the line of human ancestry back far enough, you find something that should produce a quiet, unsettling awe in every person alive. You find a species that almost didn't make it. A lineage that came so close to total erasure that the difference between your existence and complete disappearance may have come down to a few thousand people, surviving in the right place, at the right moment, in the right kind of system. For most of human history, survival was not a background condition. It was an unstable negotiation with a world that held no preference for whether we continued. And we were not alone in that negotiation. For the vast majority of human prehistory, there was not one humanity. There were many. Different human species moving across the same continents, enduring the same cold, hunting within the same fragile ecosystems. Neanderthals, Denisovans, Homo erectus. They were real, they were intelligent, they built tools, buried their dead, and survived conditions that would destroy most modern humans within days. And then, without a single moment anyone could point to, they disappeared. Not in catastrophe, not in collapse, in silence, until only one remained, us. And the question that should haunt every one of us is not why we became dominant. The question is why we did not vanish with them. Roughly 70,000 years ago, the human population may have passed through a genetic bottleneck so narrow that the entire future of our species depended on only a few thousand surviving individuals. Geneticists have found this event written directly into our DNA, in patterns of reduced diversity that should not exist if our population had always been large and stable. Something had changed in the world around us, and whatever it was, it nearly finished us entirely. Climate systems destabilized faster than ecosystems could follow. Habitats shifted. Food sources that entire regional populations had depended on for generations collapsed or migrated beyond reach. Events like the Toba supervolcanic eruption may have intensified this pressure severely, triggering atmospheric changes that altered temperatures across entire hemispheres for years. But whether Toba was the direct cause or one of many compounding stresses, the deeper truth is the same. The planet was reorganizing itself, and reorganization is what destroys systems built for stability, because survival is never truly tested in calm conditions. It is only tested when everything begins to move at once. And here is where the first great misconception breaks open. Homo sapiens were not the only ones being tested. Neanderthals were already adapted to Ice Age Europe, built for cold, built for endurance. Denisovans had survived at extreme altitudes in environments lethal to most people alive today. Homo erectus had endured environmental shifts across nearly 2 million years of existence. They were not weaker than us. They were not less capable. So why did they disappear, while we did not? To understand extinction at this level, you have to stop thinking in terms of strength and start thinking in terms of systems. Every human species operated within a survival system, a connected architecture of strategies for acquiring energy, managing heat, moving through landscapes, and transferring knowledge across time. And the most critical variable inside any survival system is not how well it performs when conditions are stable. It is how it behaves when conditions begin to fail. Neanderthals built a powerful but brittle energy system. Their diet depended heavily on large game, hunts that delivered enormous caloric return when they succeeded, and nothing when they didn't. A single failed hunt could cascade into days without adequate energy for a group already operating in extreme cold with high metabolic demands. Their tool technology, while sophisticated, changed slowly across long spans of time. Their geographic networks appear smaller and less connected than those of modern humans. None of these factors would have been fatal alone, but in combination, under rapid environmental pressure, they created a system with very little capacity to absorb repeated failure. They were specialized, deeply, powerfully, impressively specialized. And specialization is an extraordinary advantage in a stable world. but the world was no longer stable. Extinction doesn't remove the weak. It removes the ones who cannot change fast enough. Imagine a small Neanderthal group somewhere in Central Europe. The climate has been shifting for seasons now, subtly but persistently. The large game their entire caloric strategy depended on has thinned or moved or simply become harder to find. They attempt to hunt and fail. The temperature drops overnight, harder than expected. The body responds the way all mammalian bodies respond to cold and caloric deficit simultaneously. It conserves. Movement slows. The decisions that need to be made quickly become harder to make clearly. There is no reserve system large enough to absorb a second failure. There is no extended trade network delivering resources from a region where the hunt succeeded. There is no stored knowledge from a generation that already survived this exact pattern. And so, failure compounds, not dramatically, quietly. One individual weakens more than the others. Their contribution to the group decreases. The burden on the remaining members increases. Then another reaches their threshold. The group does not collapse in a single moment. It simply loses the ability to correct its own errors fast enough to survive. This is how extinction actually happens, not as a single catastrophic event on a timeline, but as a pattern of compounding stress that a system was not flexible enough to absorb. The group that does not recover this season affects the group that cannot find mates the next. A population that shrinks below a viable threshold begins a quiet slide that may take centuries to complete, but that, once begun, is extraordinarily difficult to reverse. That is the face of extinction we almost never discuss, and it is the face that matters most. Homo sapiens did something different, not because they were stronger or faster or individually more intelligent. They built a different kind of system, a system not optimized for maximum performance in stable conditions, but optimized, almost accidentally, for surviving failure. Instead of concentrating energy acquisition around large game alone, sapiens diversified: small animals, fish, plant foods requiring processing knowledge to make edible, delayed return strategies where effort today would yield resources tomorrow or next week. This meant that when one resource failed, the system adjusted rather than collapsed. Picture it as a scene, a group of sapiens processing small fish along a riverbank. Not the most impressive hunt, not the highest caloric return per hour of effort. Nearby, a Neanderthal group waits for large game that has not arrived in 3 days. The Sapiens group is eating, the Neanderthal group is not. That difference, repeated across seasons and years and generations, is not a minor advantage. It is the entire difference between a system that survives losing and one that cannot afford to lose at all. Humans didn't survive because we were better. We survived because we failed differently. Energy flexibility alone does not explain what happened. Survival at this scale also depends on something more abstract and more powerful than any caloric strategy. It depends on information, not simply knowledge, but the ability to carry knowledge beyond the individual who discovered it, beyond the group that first used it, beyond the generation that first needed it. Homo sapiens developed systems of transmission that no previous human species had built to the same degree. Language capable of encoding complex, conditional, abstract information. Symbolic behavior that attached meaning to objects in ways that persisted after the person who created them was gone. Social learning that allowed strategies to accumulate across generations rather than being rediscovered each time conditions shifted. Picture an elder showing a child how to read seasonal patterns in plant growth, transferring decades of observational knowledge into a mind that will still be alive when those patterns matter again. A mistake made by one generation did not disappear with them. It became encoded in the system itself. Neanderthal groups almost certainly shared knowledge within their communities, but their networks appear smaller, more isolated, and less connected across distance. And in a world of rapid change, isolation is not simply a social limitation. It is a survival limitation, because no single group can generate enough adaptive responses fast enough to match an environment changing across multiple dimensions simultaneously. The network is the system, and the system, with access to more information across more time, finds the response that works before the window closes. There is a layer to this story that does not fit neatly into narratives of human achievement, and that is the question of timing. Climate shifts periodically open geographic corridors out of Africa, pathways through landscapes that would otherwise have been impassable, connecting populations that had been isolated and enabling the genetic and cultural exchange that expanded human adaptive capacity. But those corridors did not stay open indefinitely. They opened according to the rhythms of a planet operating on its own schedule, indifferent to whether any particular species was ready, and then they closed again. If the timing had shifted by just a few thousand years, there might be no humans outside Africa today. If Homo sapiens had attempted their major expansions too early, the pathways they needed would not yet have existed. Too late, and those pathways would already be gone. That should produce something close to vertigo when you sit with it long enough. Some portion of our survival, perhaps larger than we are comfortable acknowledging, was not achievement. It was alignment, being the right kind of system at the right kind of moment. And that alignment was never guaranteed, never predictable, and never certain until long after it had already occurred. Homo sapiens did not simply replace the other human species that existed alongside them. What actually happened was stranger and more intimate than that. They encountered those species. They lived near them. And in ways recently confirmed through genetic analysis, they interbred with them. Fragments of Neanderthal DNA exist in the genomes of most people alive today outside sub-Saharan Africa. Fragments of Denisovan DNA persist in populations across parts of Asia and the Pacific. These are not trivial traces. They include functional immune adaptations critical for fighting pathogens in new environments, and physiological tools for surviving at high altitudes that persist in those populations today. This means something that should fundamentally shift how we understand our own survival. We did not win alone. We are, in measurable biological fact, partially composed of what remains of the species that did not make it. The boundary between survival and extinction in human prehistory was not a clean wall between us and them. It was permeable. It was negotiated. And some portion of what made us flexible enough to continue may have come directly from the ones we remember as having disappeared. They did not vanish without a trace. They became part of us. So the question sharpens, why did the others disappear? Not because they failed completely or because they were inferior in any simple sense, but because their systems were less reorganizable under conditions of rapid, sustained, unpredictable change. Specialization is a form of optimization that trades flexibility for efficiency. It works extraordinarily well in the environment it was designed for. It becomes a trap the moment that environment fundamentally shifts. Homo sapiens were not superior in strength or raw efficiency. In many specific comparisons, Neanderthals likely outperformed sapiens on physical metrics. What sapiens had was a different relationship with instability. They could change strategies faster. They could fail at a specific approach without the failure cascading into total collapse. They could absorb information and adaptive strategies from outside their immediate group in ways that continuously expanded the system's total capacity. The ability to fail safely, to lose without collapsing, to be wrong and remain in a position to try again differently, may have been the single most important survival advantage in human evolutionary history. Not strength, not dominance, the capacity to bend without breaking. Extinction doesn't remove the weak. It removes the ones who cannot change fast enough. The moment humans almost went extinct was not a single event with a date on a timeline. It was a sustained period of pressure that multiple human species reached at roughly the same time. They all faced versions of the same crisis. They all struggled against the same shifting, indifferent world. The difference is that only one lineage remained flexible enough, connected enough, and aligned enough in its timing to pass through that threshold and continue. And even that was not certain. Even our survival was contingent. It depended on factors that could have aligned differently and almost certainly would have produced a different outcome if they had. Survival is not a destination that, once reached, holds itself. It is a continuous negotiation. The reason you exist is not that humans were meant to survive. It is that at critical moment after critical moment, the system that carried us did not fail completely. It was fragile. It was imperfect. It came close to collapse more than once, but it adapted just fast enough, held just long enough, and connected just broadly enough to continue into the next generation. Human history, when you look at it clearly, is not a story of steady progress. It is a pattern of near failures that never quite reached their conclusion. And somewhere inside that pattern, across thousands of unbroken generations, the line that leads to you was never severed. Not because it was unbreakable, but because, so far, it has not broken. And if that thought stays with you when this ends, you're already looking at the world differently. That's what Prehistoric Shadows is here for.